Welcome to the Livelong Podcast, where your health is your power. Why do women experience periods, menopause, even complexity in their romantic relationships? Many of the answers lie in our evolutionary past. Today, our guest is Dr. Deena Emera. She's an evolutionary biologist whose work explores how reproduction, motherhood, and human biology evolved. And what does this mean for women today? She is also the author of the book, A Brief History of the Human Body. Welcome, Deena.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I am so happy to be here and chat with
Yes,
you.
not the first time we've talked, so I feel
No.
like it's two friends talking, which is always the best for a podcast. So you're a scientist at the Buck Institute on Aging, which happens to be one of our partners for the Livelong Women's Health Summit, and it's one of the leading centers for aging research. What are you studying there?
Yes. So I am at the Buck. I actually am part of, so there are a few of us at the Buck that are who are focused on female reproductive aging. So I am in this center focused on females and women. Um, as you mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist who has studied female bodies for most of my career. And so I study female bodies and I'm at an aging institute. So I, right now, not surprisingly, am focused on menopause and reproductive aging. I do that in kind of an unusual way. So as an evolutionary biologist, I do a lot of comparisons of humans with other mammals. And in those comparisons, what I hope to do is gain some insights about our own species.
So I know you recently went on sort of like a female Moby Dick adventure where you went to collect whale specimens, I think in Canada or Alaska.
Uh-huh.
You want to tell us a little bit about how that adventure and how that relates to your research?
Yeah, so that has really been quite the adventure and it's ongoing. Um, so one of the questions, like I just said, I do a lot of comparative work and there are some whale species that I've been really interested in actually for two reasons. So there are some whales who go through menopause like human females. So, in other words, they have these long lifespans, and then about halfway through their life, they stop reproducing, but then they keep living for decades, which is highly unusual in mammals. So, some of these animals are like orcas, killer whales. They can live into their 90s but stop reproducing in their 40s. So, very similar to humans. So, I'm really interested in that. But actually, um, I'm also interested in the opposite phenomenon, is some whales. Um, the species that I've been focused on are bowhead whales. They have an incredibly long lifespan, so they're the longest lived mammals. They can live 200 years. And in contrast to humans and killer whales, they seem to be able to reproduce for much longer than we can. So, there's evidence of a bowhead female being pregnant at like 130 years old. And so I'm really interested in that. How do they do that? What are some of the sort of mechanisms, the cellular mechanisms, mechanisms that have enabled these whales to reproduce for such a long time?
And do you connect that to human research?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of a movement right now to better understand human menopause and to ultimately give women a little bit more control over when menopause happens. And so there's so many people or a growing number of people studying this question. The angle that I take as an evolutionary biologist is, look, there are these animals out in nature that have naturally done this, right? They don't go through menopause at 50. 50, still in their sweet spot for reproduction. One of the bowhead whales that um, I'm studying right now, she was pregnant at 50. We estimate her age to have been about 50. So it's very common for bowheads at 50 to be reproducing. In contrast in our species, women at 50 just can't reproduce anymore. Obviously, they are have gone through menopause or are about to go through menopause. So my approach is let's look at animals who have naturally solved, this, I don't want to say a problem, but, something that we are trying to tackle biomedically in humans. And let's just see what the bowheads have done. If, I mean, it's not an easy task, as I've learned, to get bowhead whale ovaries. That's a tissue that I've chosen to study for a number of reasons. Um, Namely that there are still indigenous people who hunt them and they don't eat the ovaries. So, in theory, at least, one can get these ovaries to better understand, is there something different that that the ovaries are doing in the bowhead whale that could then inform, you know, future studies in humans? Like,
And you're asking sort of from a perspective of evolution. And I think, people would be very interested in understanding. It's like, why do we need to look at evolution to understand women's biology today?
yeah, that's a great question and something that I feel pretty strongly about. I mean, I think I think that there are many puzzling aspects of our biology. Periods is a great example. Most mammals don't have periods. Why do humans have them? I don't think you can answer questions like that without looking, at the evolutionary context. And when you do that, you can better understand, why some of these traits that we have exist. So I think it's great, simply for a better understanding of our own bodies. Um, I also think it's useful, from a biomedical perspective. I think if we can understand, for example, the context in which our bodies evolved, um, I mean, there are all sorts of fad diets, for example, the paleo diet and whatnot, um, that the root idea there is that our bodies evolved in a certain context, and there's sort of a mismatch now between what our bodies need and expect and what modern culture is you know what we're putting our bodies through, whether it's, we're not sleeping enough, whether it's we're eating terrible diets, whether it's we're sitting at our computers all day, so one really needs to understand, there's a whole subfield called evolutionary medicine that really focuses on using these evolutionary insights and theory and, studies to inform how we think about human health, how we, better treat humans. And I think it's an exciting and really important aspect to biomedical research.
And in your book, A Brief History of the Female Body, which I highly recommend to everyone, it's a great read. It's so interesting. It teaches you so much about evolution. You talk about a critical evolutionary breakthrough that made sexual reproduction possible in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, sexual reproduction is, many organisms on the planet reproduce sexually, but not all. The very first organisms did not, which include like all the bacteria and single-celled organisms, they reproduced asexually, which is essentially just cloning yourself. So sexual reproduction was a very important step to sort of life as we see it on the planet today. And I hate to use these terms that that bring back memories of high school biology, but really it was meiosis that was critical for sexual reproduction. And if you remember what meiosis is, it's sort of the process by which we make our eggs and sperm. So it's actually, intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. Our eggs and sperm have half the genetic content of all the other cells in our body. Um, and you have to do that if you're going to put, um, you know, the DNA from one parent and then another parent together to make a baby, right? So you kind of have to have the genetic information in the sex cells, the eggs and the sperm, so that when they go together, they have the right amount of genetic information in the offspring. So meiosis, it was like very important, and it happened. It evolved a very long time ago. But
And we
without it, we would not be here. There would
would
not
get
be
here.
males and females.
And what's so fun about the book is you sort of take that evolutionary perspective and apply it to very many parts and aspects of female sexuality. Like, for example, one of the most fascinating parts of the book is your discussion of breasts, why we have breasts. And even Darwin struggled to explain that. So explain.
Yeah. Um, So yeah, breasts. That's actually one awesome thing about writing a book is, I know a lot about some topics and I knew less about other topics. And breast is not sort of, the mammary gland to be more, accurate. The mammary gland isn't something that I had really actively studied. So this was a really fun chapter for me to write. Mammary glands are one of the defining features of mammals. So all female mammals have them and use them. Obviously, we use them to feed our babies. This was another huge evolutionary innovation. So obviously mammals, or maybe it's not obvious, but mammals are an incredibly successful group of, animals on the planet. And the mammary gland was like a key part of
They
that.
will feed babies or to attract mates.
Right. So definitely the mammary glands, it's the reason it made mammals so successful is to feed babies. And there we think, and I go through sort of the many steps of the evolution of the mammary gland in the book. We don't have time to talk about all those steps, but we think, initially they evolved from these really rudimentary, like sweat glands. Um, and so initially they were, they produced sort of this oily substance, oily, sweaty substance that protected the skin of these very early animals, that protected, these animals would secrete this substance to keep their eggs moist. Um, this oily sweat kind of had antimicrobial properties. And then over a very long period of time, these sweat glands started adding some other components to the sweat, so some nutritive components that eventually, after a very long period of time, the primary function of the mammary gland is to feed babies. And then in humans, the breast then took on, obviously the breast is important for feeding babies in humans, although culturally, we now have the ability to feed our babies in other ways, right? So we produce infant formula, but in no other species of mammal can you do that, like the mammary gland. And for most of human history, we couldn't do that, right? But in humans, the human breast is very different from the breasts of other mammals in that they are highly visible. So, in humans, we go through puberty. And at puberty, sort of two things happen. One is all the milk producing, the machinery, the ducts and the glands, that all develops. But then another component of the breast develops in humans, and this does not happen in other mammals, which is we put down a lot of fat. We lay down a lot of fat in the breast. And that is highly unusual. No other mammal does that. So, in all other mammals, the breast is the only function of it is to feed offspring. In humans, we think that there was some sexual selection happening that, that explains why our breasts look so different from the females in other species. And there's obviously quite a bit of variation in breast size in humans. And yeah, so the thought is that sexual selection was involved, which,
So feeding and sexual selection. So wait,
yes.
another mystery, and this is, you also talk about, which is, and this is related to menopause, but our periods. I mean, only 1 to 2% of mammals on the planet menstruate. Why do humans have periods at all?
Yeah, so that this is actually a topic that I have studied quite a bit myself, like in a scientific capacity, in the lab. Um, yeah, so first of all, periods are not required to successfully reproduce. 98% of mammals don't have periods. So that's very interesting. When you see a trait like that. And the other piece that's really interesting is that it's not just humans. So humans and other apes and monkeys menstruate, which that in and of itself is not surprising because, we share a common ancestor. So there was some, monkey ancestor that menstruated, and then all the species that evolved from that ancestor inherited menstruation. So that is not surprising. But what's weird is that there are like a few species that are not at all related to primates that also menstruate. So there's a few species of bat. Most bats don't menstruate, but there are a few bats that menstruate. Of the thousands of rodents that exist, only one rodent has been shown to menstruate. It's called the Egyptian spiny mouse. So very strange. And then an animal that you may have never heard of called the elephant shrew, which is related to elephants, it menstruates. So this is very weird when you see like a trait popping up in very different parts of the mammal tree, suggesting that there probably is a reason why it evolved. Um, and I could talk all day about this. I'm going to try and sum it
Describe
up in one sentence.
what
Yeah.
theory.
So I would say that the 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 short answer is we don't know. But I think that the evidence that we have suggests that it's part of this really sophisticated screening mechanism that a few of us mammals have, to basically weed out and to encourage implantation of like the best embryos. So we think it's this very sophisticated part of, it's not the bleeding per se that's the critical trait, but it's tied to this other trait that we all have, the menstruating mammals, which is like what happens to our uterus during every cycle. Um, and menstruation is kind of a byproduct of that, but or is very closely tied to this monthly preparation of our uterus. And why does that happen? We think it happens to screen for the best embryos. It turns out that humans and some of those monkeys that I was talking about who menstruate, we make a lot of embryos that will just never make it. It's why so many pregnancies are lost very early on. That's highly unusual in mammals. We don't know exactly why that happens in our species and in those rhesus monkeys, but we know that it's sort of a fact. Like we lose so many of our very early embryos. We think that is happening through this screening process. And really, the reason that it's important to screen is that as a female mammal, you want to invest your energy and your time and your resources in the offspring that are going to make it and reproduce themselves. I mean, that's what evolution is about, right? That's what natural selection is about. It's about the genes, and individuals that are able to pass on more of their genes. And so
Survival of the fittest.
exactly. It's not really the fittest, it's survival of the most reproductively active, the ones that are most prolific.
Oh, that raises so many possible questions, but I'm going to shift the topic a little bit to something about longevity. Well, before we get to really to longevity, I want to talk a
Mhm.
little bit about sex. And the reason is because everyone's saying now that having a great sex life is very key to your aging well, aging happily, feeling joy. And it turns out that one of the most important parts of sex for men and for women, the orgasm, has an evolutionary background. So everybody remembers that famous scene in the movie When Harry Met Sally, which you talk about in your book, where Sally actually shows that women can fake orgasm. She's sitting at a diner and fakes an orgasm. And the lady turns to her and says, I want what she's having.
Yeah.
But why evolutionarily do women have orgasms?
So I had a lot of fun writing. That's sort of the introduction to my orgasm chapter. And when I wrote it, I was not thinking about the fact that I would be reading it out loud. I have like an audiobook version of my book. And I read it. And so it was really funny. I was working with this total stranger and I had to like read that scene out over and over again until I got it right. Anyway, so that was fun and a little bit awkward. Um, so, orgasm. Um, there's no question about why orgasms exist in males. Orgasm is tied to sperm release, right? So it's very clear that the orgasm in males is an adaptation, right? That is like absolutely tied to the reproductive success. If you don't have the orgasm as a male, you're not going to pass on your sperm. And so it's very important. The puzzle is why women have orgasms because you don't need to have an orgasm to reproduce. So there is like a decades long debate in the literature about the function, if at all, of the if there is a function of the female orgasm. Um, so
Is there
why does it exist? Again, another question that's hard to answer. Um, some people have argued that it's sort of a byproduct of male orgasm. So it turns out that the clitoris, which is the site of the female orgasm, there's the site where it starts, the clitoris in females and the penis in males, they're they develop from exactly the same tissue. We call these tissues homologous. So in a very early embryo, you can't distinguish between a penis and a clitoris, and they're actually developing from exactly the same place in the embryo. And the final anatomical structures actually look very similar, are made of the same components, but obviously they don't look exactly the same. And so some have argued, oh, well, the reason females have a clitoris and the reason they have an orgasm is simply because males need them, and these two structures originate from the same tissue. So we have shared development, and so it's just an accident that they happen in females. That's one sort of explanation. There are many other explanations that say no, 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 no. The female orgasm absolutely evolved in females for a very specific reason. It's just that no one can agree on what that reason is. And
and, and
there's, yeah.
and part of that is because the female body really just hasn't been historically studied. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that the clitoris was only fully mapped anatomically like 2 decades ago.
Yes. Yes and no. I mean, I would say um, in European textbooks and sort of, medical books. Maybe it was better mapped. Certainly in American, Grey's Anatomy and whatnot, it wasn't mapped correctly. Um, But yeah, it wasn't until like the late 90s, early 2000s that there was, this sort of surge of interest in the clitoris and the orgasm. And not surprisingly, the people who were doing those studies were women, right? So yes, as with everything in, human health and anatomy, it really feels like research is kind of decades research on female bodies and female physiology and female health is behind where it should be because for so long we've used male bodies, and that's not to say that the research doesn't exist. It has lagged behind, unfortunately. But I hate to paint
And
things in a negative light. Like there is a lot of interest now and many more women going into science, and it's fantastic. Obviously, I've written a book about the female body. Like I I find it fascinating, and I find the body beautiful, and I think it's capable of amazing things. And I love any opportunity to celebrate our bodies and to better understand our bodies. And so I love that this conference is doing just that and bringing together other people who feel the same way about the female body.
yes,
So,
we'll push the science forward. It's a great way. So, one last question. It's at the top of the hour. So, let's talk a little bit about sex and love. We've been talking about sex, but let's talk about love. From an evolutionary perspective, who chooses whom, men or women?
oh yeah, that's a great question, and I think one of my favorite chapters to write. Um, It depends. If you're talking about humans, I think the answer is both. Men and women are doing the choosing. If you look at other animals, it really depends. You need to look at the sex that's doing the childcare and going through the long incubation of the eggs. And, typically it tends to be the females that are doing the lion's share of the work of having babies and making and raising babies and whatnot. So we see these correlations across species. The individual that's doing all that work tends to be the one who's choosing. So the female in many, many species is doing all the work. All the male is doing is contributing his sperm. And so she is looking around and choosing the mate whom she thinks is going to produce the best offspring. And there's all kinds of debate about what makes the best offspring and what makes the best mate. And it completely varies by species. And there's all kinds of debate about it. But I think, who is doing the choosing really depends on who's doing the work of having kids, who is spending the time, who is spending the energy. And in humans, biparental care or care from both the mother and the father is pretty universal across species. Obviously, there's variation. Women still, there are some constraints built into the system. So we go through the long pregnancy. We are the ones nursing the offspring. So, definitely females are doing some choosing, but again, universal human trait is paternal involvement in, his children, whether it's providing or, actually physically engaged in the childcare. Um, and so males also are choosy. And the really cool stories, just to support this idea that the choosing has to do with who's caring for the offspring, the really cool stories are the species where there's been a role reversal, where the females are doing no work or very little work relative to the males who are, incubating the eggs in some famous bird species. Even in some primates, the males, the dads, are the ones carrying the babies around. The moms are much less involved. And in those cases, it's the males who are choosy. So, the females are less choosy and the males are the ones making the choices. So,
Well, that just brings up so many questions about modern relationships, which we could continue talking about for a very long time. But unfortunately, our time is coming to a close. So, one last question. What's the most surprising thing you've learned about the evolution of women?
the most surprising thing, I wouldn't say it's surprising, but I think it's the coolest thing, is the lengths to which female animals, including female humans, go for choice. So um, they care a lot about, like, extending on what we were just talking about. Females care a lot about who fathers their offspring, and they care a lot about being able to make the choice themselves. And in many species, including in humans, but it doesn't seem to be as extreme in humans, males are trying to thwart our choice. Um, and so females go through just they've evolved amazing behaviors, amazing anatomy. So, anyway, this is one of the topics I find most fascinating, and the stories are just really incredible. We don't have time to talk about them, but like there are some species of dolphin, for example, where the females have evolved these really convoluted vaginas, essentially because in that species, the males gang rape the females. So the females don't have a lot of choice um, on who to mate with, but to retain the freedom of they want the choice of who the father is. And so to retain that freedom of choice, they've evolved this really convoluted anatomy that enables them basically to direct sperm of an unwanted male to these sort of dead end pockets of the vagina, and sperm from a wanted male, sort of straight access to her eggs. And the varied, stories across mammals that do this, I just think is so interesting and relevant
To
to
life.
our species.
Now we have so many different kinds of choices that women are making in terms of
Absolutely.
in terms of mate choice and men. And anyway, so it's great to talk to you, Deena. Thank you so much for joining us. Your book is so great. Everybody should read it, A Brief History of the Female Body, and check out Deena's work at the Buck Institute, our partner. And I hope you have a great Monday.
Thank you. You too. That was fun.